Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
They say the human brain protects you from trauma by erasing details, dulling memories, softening the sharp edges. But I remember every single word they said that day, down to the way my mom kept folding the same napkin in her lap, over and over, like she needed something to do with her hands while she quietly shattered what little trust I still had left in her. We were sitting in that old booth at Pine Grove Diner, one of those places soaked in decades of stale coffee and bitter conversations, when she looked me straight in the eye and said, "Jenna, I'm so sorry, but we just can't afford to help with the surgery right now." No tremble in her voice, no hesitation, just practiced concern. And my dad, sitting across from me, nodded slowly like he was mourning some fictional bank account balance. Meanwhile, I was doing the math in my head, and it didn't add up, not even close. The surgery wasn't optional, it wasn't cosmetic or experimental or some luxury thing I'd dreamed up on a whim. It was spinal decompression surgery, the kind where if you wait too long, the nerves can be permanently damaged. I'd been living with pain that radiated down both legs for over a year, waking up in the middle of the night in tears, unable to sit through a full workday, and slowly losing function in my left foot. My doctor told me I had a 6-month window before the odds of permanent disability started climbing. And even though I had some insurance, the out-of-pocket cost was still high, more than I could cover on my own. So I asked for help. Not charity, help. And what I got instead was a polite, gut-punching rejection served with a side of lukewarm coffee and awkward silence. They blamed the economy, the market, some vague, unexpected expenses. My mom even added, "We're just trying to be careful these days. Retirement's not what it used to be." And I remember thinking, careful? You were careful when you spent 10 grand on a new patio last spring. You were careful when you flew out to Hawaii for Mark's birthday. You were careful when you co-signed his 3rd business loan, even though the first 2 barely broke even. But when it came to my spine, my health, you suddenly became accountants with empty pockets and a strong sense of fiscal responsibility. Here's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't usually come with fireworks or screaming matches. Sometimes it's delivered in a quiet voice, in a familiar place, by people who still ask if you want cream with your coffee. And sometimes it doesn't hit you right away. You drive home numb, thinking maybe they really can't help. Maybe the economy really is that bad. You give them the benefit of the doubt because that's what daughters do. But then just a few weeks later, your brother, your golden, perfect, always deserving brother, calls you on speakerphone while you're still lying on your couch recovering from a panic attack. And he says, "Guess what Mom and Dad did? They bought me a beach house. Can you believe it?" He was laughing, like it was a joke, like we were all in on it. A beach house, not a used one, not a fixer-upper, a brand new 3-bedroom home on the Outer Banks, with a wraparound porch and whitewashed siding and a deck overlooking the water. He called it a reward for working hard. That's the word he used, a reward. I remember the sound of waves in the background as he talked. They were there with him. They'd flown out to sign the papers and celebrate. My mom even sent me a photo later, Mark in a linen shirt, holding a champagne glass with her arm draped around him, and the caption, "So proud of this one. Hard work pays off." I stared at that photo until my phone timed out and went black in my hand. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't even respond. I just sat there thinking, they didn't help me because they didn't want to. They had the money, they just didn't see me as the investment. And maybe that's what cut the deepest. Not the pain in my back, not the surgery I had to navigate alone, but the realization that my own parents had weighed me against my brother and decided, he's the one worth building a future for. Me? I was just a liability, a bill they didn't feel like paying. Have you ever had that moment? The one where something shifts permanently inside you? Where someone you love shows you exactly who they are, and you know, deep in your gut, that there's no going back. That was mine, right there in my dark living room, holding my phone like it might bite me, while outside my window, the neighborhood kids rode their bikes and laughed like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. They had made their choice. And so would I. The first real symptom didn't arrive with a bang or a warning. It came quietly, disguised as a minor inconvenience. An occasional numbness in my toes after a long day at work, something I wrote off as a pinched nerve or poor posture. But over the weeks, that numbness spread, growing into something colder, deeper, more insistent. I started limping without realizing it, dragging my left leg behind me like dead weight, and by the time the pain reached my hip and carved its way down the sciatic nerve like a dull blade, I knew something was wrong, truly dangerously wrong. It took months of appointments, MRIs, referrals, and specialists until someone finally gave it a name that made sense: lumbar spinal stenosis with nerve impingement. In other words, the space in my spine that should have let my nerves move freely had narrowed, choking off signals and circulation, and if I didn't intervene soon, I could lose permanent function in my leg. My neurosurgeon didn't mince words. He told me, with clinical detachment honed from years of seeing people wait too long, that I was already showing signs of nerve damage and that my best shot at recovery would be decompression surgery, ideally within the next few months. The estimate for the procedure, even with insurance, sat like a stone in my stomach. Between deductibles, hospital fees, and post-op physical therapy, I was looking at just under $18,000. And while I had about $5,000 saved, because I've always been the kind of person who plans for emergencies, I was still way short. Asking for help didn't come naturally to me. I'd moved out young, paid my own way through college with grants and night shifts, and spent most of my adult life trying not to be a burden on anyone, especially not my parents. But this was different. This wasn't a car breaking down or rent running late. This was my health, my body failing me in a way that I couldn't fix alone. When I brought it up to my parents, it wasn't even a formal ask. I eased into it, cautiously, like someone testing the temperature of a lake before stepping in. We were having brunch, one of those awkward, twice-a-year events that start with good intentions and end with someone checking their watch. I mentioned the diagnosis, the urgency, the cost, all while downplaying the desperation in my voice. I half hoped they'd offer before I even had to say the words. Instead, my mother frowned in that way she always did when she was deciding whether or not something was your fault. "That's awful, honey," she said, her fork pushing eggs around her plate like they'd offended her. "But things are tight right now. Your dad and I are trying to be very careful with the market the way it is." My father chimed in without lifting his eyes from his coffee. "And you know we helped you with that car back in college. What was it, $5,000? Things add up." I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and remind them that it wasn't a gift. It was a loan I paid back over 2 years with interest. But instead, I nodded. I swallowed it. I thanked them for listening. And then I went home and stared at the ceiling for 3 straight hours, wondering if maybe I really was asking for too much. Over the next few weeks, I scrambled. I called the insurance company again, rechecked every line of the bill, called 2 hospitals for second opinions, and even set up a quiet GoFundMe, which I never shared because the thought of people knowing how bad things had gotten made me nauseous. Eventually, I took out a medical loan with a suffocating interest rate, scheduled the surgery for the earliest available date, and arranged for a friend of a friend to drive me home from the hospital since I wouldn't be able to move well for at least a week. The morning of the surgery, I was terrified. Not of the procedure itself, but of the thought that I could wake up worse, that I'd gone into debt and risked my body for something that might not even work. No family waiting room hugs, no warm hands holding mine as I went under, just a nurse who barely knew my name wheeling me into a fluorescent-lit theater that smelled like antiseptic and resignation. The worst part came after. The pain was brutal, a deep, raw ache wrapped in stiffness and fire that throbbed through every inch of my lower back and down my legs like a punishment. I had to crawl to the bathroom the first night home, doped up and dizzy, crying not from the pain, but from the humiliating awareness that there was no one there to help. I slept on the couch, surrounded by pill bottles, heating pads, and a bell I didn't ring because there was no one to hear it anyway. A few days into recovery, I got a voicemail from my mom. Cheerful, breezy, like she was leaving a message for someone she hadn't talked to in months. Not her daughter who'd just had spinal surgery. Hey, sweetheart, just checking in. Hope everything went okay with the back thing. We're heading down to see Mark for the weekend. He's got something exciting to show us. Talk soon. That message played in my head for days. It echoed in the silence of my apartment, in the shuffle of my walker, in every ice pack I replaced on my swollen back. I didn't respond, not because I couldn't, but because I realized, somewhere in the middle of all that pain, that the silence between us had finally started making more sense than the conversations ever did. And I began to wonder, if this was the way they acted when I was vulnerable, what did that say about the years I'd spent thinking they cared? Or worse, what did it say about me for taking this long to see it? The days blurred into nights with no real distinction, just a cycle of dull agony, shallow breathing, and the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from activity, but from bracing yourself for pain that never really leaves. It just shifts locations. I had created a little recovery station in my living room, a pathetic arrangement of pillows and medication bottles, where I spent most of my time half sitting, half lying down, trying not to twist the wrong way or sneeze too hard, terrified of what even the smallest movement could undo. The loneliness crept in slowly at first, disguised as quiet, as a chance to rest, but within a few days it had settled into every corner of the apartment like mildew, coating even the smallest comfort with a layer of something bitter and deeply humiliating. No one came to visit. Not my parents, not my brother, not even a neighbor offering to take out the trash or bring me soup. I had posted once on Facebook, more out of obligation than expectation, a generic "surgery went well, recovering at home" message, with a smiling selfie that did more to hide the truth than reveal it. And the responses came in the form of heart emojis and speedy recovery comments from people who hadn't spoken to me in years. A few acquaintances offered help in the form of, "Let me know if you need anything," which we all know is a polite way of saying, "I hope you don't ask." And I didn't ask. Because the truth is, by that point, I had already started to internalize what they had implied, that I was not worth the inconvenience, not worth the drive, not worth the money, not even worth a damn casserole and a half-hour visit. I had always thought that when something serious happened, when life really knocked you down, your people would show up. But sometimes, life doesn't just knock you down. It shows you who's willing to step over you on their way to something better. The days passed in a thick silence, broken only by the occasional beep of the microwave or the buzz of my phone, which I had started to keep face down most of the time, because each notification felt like a cruel reminder of how performative concern had replaced real compassion. The pain meds made me nauseous. The heating pad barely touched the ache in my lower back, and the physical therapist's voice on the phone, calm, instructional, distant, was the only human interaction I got that didn't make me feel like I was being pitied or tolerated. Then one afternoon, maybe 10 days into recovery, as I struggled to adjust my position on the couch with a grunt that felt like it came from somewhere deeper than my lungs, I opened Instagram purely out of habit. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't expecting anything. But what I saw felt like someone had reached through the screen and slapped me across the face. It was a photo. Mark, my brother, standing barefoot on a wide wooden deck, the kind that wrapped around a house you could only afford if you'd either won the lottery or been handed a significant financial head start. He was holding a glass of champagne, shirt half unbuttoned like he'd just come back from a casual yacht cruise, with our mother next to him, smiling like she'd just given birth to him all over again. The caption read, "Big congrats to Mark, hard work pays off, officially a beach house owner." I stared at that photo for so long I forgot to blink. My spine throbbed with pain, my body was stiff and swollen, and I was lying alone in a dark apartment surrounded by empty pill bottles and silence, while the people who had told me they just couldn't afford to help me were out celebrating with my brother, smiling in the sun, champagne in hand, on the deck of a brand new coastal property. There was no mention of loans, no GoFundMe, no debt consolidation, just celebration, just pride, just joy for the son who, as far as I could tell, had never heard the word no in his life. In that moment, something inside me went quiet. Not numb, not defeated, just utterly still, like a lake after the last ripple fades. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my phone across the room or call anyone to confront them. I didn't even cry, because what I felt wasn't heartbreak anymore. It was clarity. Cold, sharp, irreversible clarity. They didn't help me because they didn't want to. They had the money, they had the means, they had the time. But when they weighed the worth of that money, me broken and asking for help, against the pleasure of giving Mark a reward, a gift, a shiny symbol of pride, I lost. And here's the part that still makes me sick if I think about it too long. They never expected me to notice. That's how sure they were of my loyalty, of my quietness, of my desperation to stay part of their little family theater. They thought I'd see that post, smile politely, and maybe leave a congrats bro in the comments before dragging myself back to bed with pain in my spine and fake joy in my heart. Instead, I did nothing. I didn't comment. I didn't call. I didn't mention it the next time they texted. Because I finally understood something I probably should have known a long time ago. Love, at least in some families, isn't unconditional. It's transactional. And I was no longer interested in paying a price just to be tolerated. So I sat there, in my dimly lit apartment, with a spine full of staples and a heart full of realization, and made a decision I didn't even say out loud. From now on, I wouldn't beg for a seat at a table where I was only ever considered an afterthought. They had made their choice, and now I had made mine. There are moments in life when clarity doesn't come through epiphany or explosive confrontation, but through a long, deliberate silence that builds over time like sediment. Each layer representing another disappointment, another forgotten birthday, another unanswered call, until eventually the weight becomes undeniable and something inside you shifts, not violently, not with fanfare, but with the quiet finality of a door locking from the inside. That's what happened to me in the weeks following my recovery, once the physical pain began to fade and the emotional bruising took center stage, sharp and disorienting in a way that no prescribed medication could dull. I began to move around more, make my own meals, return slowly to the rhythms of daily life, but the version of myself that had gone into surgery, a daughter still hoping to be chosen, still willing to excuse, still waiting for acknowledgement, she never fully came back. It started with the phone calls, or more accurately, the absence of them. My mother, ever the queen of selective compassion, would leave cheerful voicemails, as if we hadn't skipped over the part where she ignored my crisis entirely. Her voice coded in that artificial concern that sounded like a woman trying to convince herself she was still a good person. She asked vague questions, avoided specific mentions of my health, and inserted little updates about Mark and his new house, his new job opportunity, his latest dinner party, like those things should interest me, like they weren't salt in a wound so deep it had bypassed anger and gone straight to disdain. My father, quieter by nature, did what he always did, followed her lead, chimed in occasionally with a "hey kiddo," and then drifted off like a ghost in the background of his own family story. At first, I told myself I needed time. Time to process, time to rest, time to figure out how I wanted to move forward without defaulting to the same script I'd been reading from for years. But as the days turned to weeks and the silence stretched out like a protective barrier, I began to realize that what I was doing wasn't just avoidance. It was my own form of revenge. And not the kind you act out with dramatic gestures or bitter words, but the kind that slices deeper. Absence, withdrawal, indifference. I didn't scream. I didn't confront. I didn't demand explanations or apologies. I simply disappeared from their narrative. When Thanksgiving rolled around, I didn't RSVP to my mother's email. I didn't respond to the follow-up text or the guilt-laced voicemail about how much everyone would love to see me. I spent that day alone, not because I had nowhere to go, but because I wanted the solitude more than I wanted another performance. I cooked my own meal, poured a glass of wine, and watched a documentary about people who had cut ties with toxic families. Not for revenge, but for survival. And as I sat there, full of stuffing and quiet satisfaction, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: control. Christmas came and went in much the same way. They sent a card with a photo of Mark and his new girlfriend in front of the beach house, all white smiles and designer scarves, and I tossed it into the trash unopened. There was a small box, too, postmarked from my mother, filled with some meaningless gift: candles, a book I'd never read, a scarf I'd never wear, and I left it sealed on a shelf until I eventually donated it, untouched, to a local shelter. It wasn't about punishing them with my silence. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I'd given away too cheaply for too long. My attention, my energy, my hope. What surprised me most was how long it took them to notice that something had shifted. Maybe they thought I was just busy or still recovering or going through a phase, because parents like mine don't notice subtle changes unless they're forced to. But eventually, even they had to acknowledge that the daughter who once returned every call, sent thank you notes for birthday cards, and asked about their well-being even when hers was crumbling, had gone quiet in a way that didn't feel temporary. It was Mark who reached out first, of course. Always the golden boy, always the peacemaker when things got too uncomfortable. He sent a text one random Wednesday afternoon that simply said, "Hey, been thinking about you. Hope you're okay." I stared at it for a full hour before typing a single word and hitting send. Don't. No explanation, no punctuation, no invitation for further discussion, just a boundary. And he got the message, because he never responded. And honestly, that silence was the first gift he ever gave me that I actually wanted. Over the next few months, I began to rebuild my life, piece by piece, not around the absence of my family, but around the presence of my own strength. I started going back to work part-time, joined a local yoga class to help with flexibility, reconnected with a few old friends who didn't ask where I'd been, but welcomed me back without judgment. I even began to sleep through the night without waking up in a panic, something I hadn't done since before the diagnosis. The more distance I created, the clearer everything became, like fog lifting from a highway, revealing just how far off course I'd been driving all these years, chasing something that was never actually there. People think revenge needs to be loud, theatrical, destructive, but the most satisfying revenge I've ever tasted came not from burning bridges, but from quietly walking away from them while they still thought I was standing on the other side, waiting to be let in. I didn't cut my family off out of spite. I did it because I finally believed I deserved more than the crumbs they had been offering me my whole life. And in that quiet, in that deliberate absence, I found a kind of peace that their approval could never have given me. They had made their priorities clear. Now it was my turn. It was a funeral that brought us back together, though I hesitate to use the word together, because no part of what happened that day felt like a reunion or a healing or any sort of resolution. Just a convergence of bodies, dressed in black, pretending for a few hours that grief makes everyone kinder or closer, or suddenly aware of their failures. It was my aunt who had passed, my father's only sister, a woman I'd been close to in a way that probably made my mother quietly resentful over the years, though she never said it aloud, just pursed her lips whenever I mentioned that Aunt Carla actually listened when I spoke. The service was held in a cramped little church that smelled like wilted flowers and sadness, the kind of place where everyone lowers their voice even if there's no sermon happening, as if death has a volume limit we're all afraid to cross. I hadn't planned to go. I'd hovered over the decision for days, weighing the peace I'd carved out for myself, against the small part of me that still felt like I owed something to Carla, for the birthdays she never forgot, the books she mailed without reason, the card she sent after my surgery with a $20 bill folded inside and the words, "For tea and toast on hard days." She'd meant something to me, and while I hated the thought of seeing my parents again, of having to look into their carefully curated expressions of concern, I hated the thought of not saying goodbye to Carla even more. So I put on a black dress that no longer fit quite right after months of physical therapy and solitude, pulled my hair back with the kind of restraint I used to think looked mature, and drove myself to the service with a stomach full of concrete and something close to dread. They were already seated when I arrived. My father's shoulders had sunk deeper into his frame, his face hollowed in a way I hadn't seen before, and my mother, still perfectly composed, still wearing lipstick too bright for the occasion, looked up at me with a flicker of something that might have been surprise, or relief, or maybe just the recognition that her hold on me had finally slipped. Mark was there too, flanked by the same girlfriend from the Christmas card, his hand resting on her leg, like a man performing the role of someone who has it all together. For a moment, the room stood still. No one spoke, no one moved. And then I walked past them, not pausing, not acknowledging, just sliding into a pew at the back with the quiet confidence of someone who owed no explanations and intended to offer none. The service was short, filled with platitudes and hymns, and a few scripted memories read from folded papers, and when it ended, the congregation spilled out onto the lawn in clusters, hugging, crying, sharing casseroles and contact information they'd never use. I stayed near the edge of the group, watching, waiting, knowing the moment would come when one of them, likely my mother, would decide that it was the right time to confront me under the guise of care. And sure enough, it wasn't long before she crossed the grass with that brittle smile she wore like armor, her heels sinking slightly into the dirt with each step. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, arms already reaching out as if the last 2 years had been a misunderstanding, as if the silence hadn't been deafening, as if I'd just forgotten to write. I didn't flinch, but I didn't embrace her either. I let her arms fall, let the awkwardness hang between us like a curtain no one dared to lift. "We've been so worried about you," she continued, her voice trembling just enough to suggest sincerity, but not enough to actually feel like truth. "Why haven't you come home?" I looked at her, at the woman who had raised me on half-truths and pretty stories about sacrifice, who had always known how to control a room but never how to nurture a daughter, and I realized in that instant that nothing I said would ever be enough. Not for her, not for them. They didn't want the truth. They wanted the illusion of a happy family restored, a clean slate wiped of all the things they'd conveniently forgotten. But I wasn't interested in illusions anymore. "I didn't come home," I said, my voice calm, steady, unmoved by the emotion in hers, "because you showed me exactly where I stood." She blinked, as if the words were in another language, as if she'd expected something softer, something forgivable. My father had wandered over by then, silent as always, hands in his coat pockets like a man waiting out the weather. Mark stood a few feet away, watching, not interfering, maybe for once sensing that this wasn't a performance he could charm his way through. No one else spoke. No one moved to stop me. I looked at them all, these people who had once been my whole world, and felt nothing but distance, clean, sharp, earned. And then I turned and walked away. No dramatic exit, no parting words, just the sound of gravel under my shoes and the breeze cutting through the trees like an exhale I'd been holding for years. They didn't follow, they didn't call, and I didn't look back. Because the truth is, sometimes revenge doesn't come in the form of raised voices or broken dishes or grand declarations. Sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply living your life without the people who once made you feel small, who once convinced you that their neglect was your fault, that their love had to be earned through suffering and silence. My revenge was survival. It was peace. It was knowing that I had finally, irrevocably chosen myself. And as I drove away from that church, from that version of myself they had spent decades molding, I didn't feel empty, I didn't feel bitter. I felt free.